All right, well, we're going to continue this morning in the book of Matthew, and the Pharisees have been doing their very best to undermine Jesus and his ministry, and that's where we are in the story. And what we are going to see is that these enemies of Christ are going to start approaching things from a different angle. Up until this point, they had been trying to discredit Jesus in the eyes of the people. Of course, they hadn't really been doing that very well. Whatever question that they had to trap him, whatever accusation that they made, nothing that they said or did could really stick against Jesus. Jesus always had an answer. And so if they couldn't disprove Jesus' credibility, well, they thought, let's make Jesus prove his own credibility. Let's put him on the spot to come up with something that, proves that he is who he's saying and claiming to be beyond a shadow of a doubt. And so here we have Matthew 12:38, and this is what happened. Then some of the scribes and Pharisees answered him, saying, "Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you." But he answered them, "An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for they repented at the preaching of Jonah. And behold, something greater than Jonah is here. The queen of the south will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And behold, something greater than Solomon is here." I like this little routine that the Pharisees put on here. It's cute. It's pretty obvious they hate Jesus and everything that he stands for, but if they show themselves for who they really are to the people, well, then nobody's going to take them seriously anymore. And so here's them pretending that they are objective and neutral, and they say, we're just searching for the truth. Jesus, Jesus, we sure would love to believe in you and all of that, but you've got to help us out here. Throw us a bone. Just do some sign that proves you are everything you say. And they didn't have this phrase back in those days, but if they did, then we would probably be reading this in these verses. And then the Pharisees gaslighted Jesus by asking for a sign. Because it's not like he hadn't spent, just the last year of his life traveling from town to town, performing every possible sign that could prove to them that, in fact, he was who he claimed to be. It wasn't like he hadn't just casted out a demon right in front of their eyes literally minutes ago. Now, in response to that sign, these very guys said, "Well, you can only do that because you're on Satan's side, Jesus." And that is literally what they just said. And now they say, "Oh, Jesus, just give us a sign." That's all we're asking. The topic of our sermon today is what our hearts are looking for. And I think one of the things that this whole interchange points out is that what we have in our hearts can affect what we see in the world and what we fail to see. The Pharisees were just simple men seeking a sign, you see. And Jesus looked them in the eyes and said, "No." Because here's the thing. God has no obligation to prove himself to anyone. Grace is his to give. And even though in so many places we see so clearly that Jesus wants everyone to come to him, that if we truly seek him, then he will show himself to us. So, we can't take this the wrong way, but still, the burden is never on God to perform for us on demand. In fact, if for anyone to even take that attitude, the attitude that the Pharisees have demonstrated here for us today, if we do that, then we are really the only thing that we're doing is just doubling down on the very thing that is in our heart that is keeping us from God. And we are only entrenching ourselves further into the problems of our rebellion against God. Because only a rebellious heart thinks, let God come to me. Is that what our hearts are looking for God to come to us at our demand? But here is the thing. If we have a repentant heart, which is required for salvation, then the irony is that we will see that God has already come for us. And now it's our turn to come to him. And this is what Jesus means when he tells the Pharisees, you will get the sign of Jonah, just like everyone else. And the sign of Jonah is the symbolism of Jonah, who was swallowed for 3 days by death, but who then came forward from what should have been his grave. Jesus is saying, my death and my resurrection will prove to you who I am. And each and every person who hears the gospel gets to hear precisely how God did come to us. The gospel explains God's wisdom and God's perfect plan for salvation. And we must be careful that in our hearts we do not hold in contempt the wisdom of God. You know, whatever it was that the Pharisees were looking for, God wasn't it. After all Jesus said and did, if it was God's king that they were looking for, then they would have seen him standing right there in front of him. And you see, that is why Jesus brings up the queen who sought out the wisdom of Solomon, for she traveled the known world to find God's wisdom. And when she saw it, she knew what it was. And yet, here sit those who had God's wisdom brought to them, and they couldn't see it when it sat right in front of them. And so here is the thing that we have to ask ourselves in all of our searching. What are we really looking for? If it was there before us, would we even see it? Because if Jesus is standing before us today and it's not him, well, then we have to understand the warning that Christ will give us this morning. This next passage, it's very cryptic, but when we understand it in the context of all that we've been speaking of this morning, the meaning will become clear. Here in verse 43, we read it. Jesus says, when the unclean spirit has gone out of a person, it passes through waterless places seeking rest, but finds none. Then it says, I will return to my house from which I came. And when it comes, it finds the house empty, swept, and put in order. Then it goes and brings with it 7 other spirits, more evil than itself, and they enter and dwell there. And the last state of that person is worse than the first. So also will it be with this evil generation. You know, a bad situation can always get worse, and even if we have a bad situation, and maybe for a little while we think that we're going to be getting along okay, maybe we've straightened things out a bit, but we never actually found something that truly fills our hearts with goodness. We are only leaving things empty for the next bad thing to come along. We must realize what could be waiting for us if we turn away from God and what he is offering us. It has been put like this. Imagine every one of us is like a spider hanging on a thread of webbing over a great and roaring fire. Life is so fragile. Our own destinies, all of them, hang in the balance of what could very well be a single breath. You see, this is the danger of remaining neutral about the gospel. This is the danger in thinking that all we need is a little rehab, all we need is a little of this or maybe a little of that, and then we're going to be okay. But we aren't looking at the root issue. The Bible tells us that without God, we are slaves to sin. And it also tells us that God will punish sin. And it is tragic to think that for people who do not receive the salvation that Jesus gives, that this life is literally and to a very large degree the very best that they will ever know. We have to see that this is the point of what Jesus is telling the Pharisees. Well, come on, Pastor Brian, he's talking about demons here, so what is that about? And let me tell you something. As fascinating as it may be to ponder the inner workings of demon possession, of one being cast out for 7 to take its place, those details aren't the point, are they? Because Jesus only says this story as an analogy to make his point. This is just an analogy for the thing that he's been talking about for pretty much the entire chapter. Jesus is before us, giving our hearts what they really need for all eternity. And the point of the analogy is, look, the house, it was swept and put in order, but it was empty. And the point is, what Jesus is bringing is the good thing that we need to fill our hearts. What it is really, I wonder, what really is the thing that our hearts are seeking? And I hope that we can say that it's God's grace. And if we are truly seeking God's grace, then we will only find it in the Son that God sent. And if we understand that, then we will understand what Jesus is about to do next. Matthew 12. Starting in verse 46, while he was still speaking to the people, behold, his mother and his brothers stood outside, asking to speak to him. But he replied to the man who told him, who is my mother, and who are my brothers? And stretching out his hand towards his disciples, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. If we are truly looking for what we should in this life, God's grace above all, then these words are clear as day. Jesus is inside being pressed upon by the masses of people who have come to him. Likely he has skipped a meal or two. Likely he is tired, and his mother, as any mother would, wants to make sure that in taking care of others, Jesus himself is taken care of. His brothers, as a good son would, are helping their mother get to Jesus. Somebody, I'm sure with good intentions, interrupts Jesus as he is speaking on the most important and eternal truths that anyone could ever hear, in order to tell him, hey, Jesus, your mom's here. Jesus, your mom's here. Now, like I said, we really have no reason to doubt the motives of anyone mentioned here, but nevertheless, the situation being as it is, Jesus addresses the crowd and uses even this interruption to drive home his point. Whatever it is in life that we think is important compared to this, compared to understanding our spiritual condition and what we have to do about it. Look, nothing comes even close to being as important as this. Jesus says, whoever does the will of my Father, these are the ones that I call mother and brother and sister. Those listening to Jesus' words are doing the Father's will. And you know what? When we hunger to hear his words, this shows us that our hearts are looking for the right thing. It shows us that we know that God's grace is the only thing that can fill our hearts. And Jesus sees that and he says, listen, these people who are listening to my words, they're the reason I'm here. And you know what? That's us. He came for us. And what a joyous thing to realize that he is what our hearts have been looking for all along. Amen?